Emily Dawson sought a fresh start when she moved into the Hensley house, a historic mansion with a mysterious past. But what she thought would be a peaceful new chapter quickly turned into a fight for survival as she uncovered dark secrets hidden within its walls. From eerie encounters to cryptic journals, Emily is thrust into a battle against a sinister force that threatens everything she holds dear. With her courage and resilience put to the test, can she reclaim her home, or will its terrifying history consume her? Stay tuned to uncover the chilling twists of this gripping story. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to catch our next thrilling narrative. Let's dive in. The town of Ravenwood stretched beneath a slate-gray sky, its streets lined with old Victorian homes whose weathered facades whispered stories of generations past. Emily Harper, newly 28 and freshly returned to her hometown, parked her dusty blue sedan outside one such house. It stood tall and imposing, its dark shutters like watchful eyes. Her decision to return had been impulsive, fueled by a string of disappointments and a yearning for something simpler, something familiar. Her job in the city had been everything she thought she wanted until it wasn't. Promotions came with endless hours, relationships frayed under the weight of neglected anniversaries, and her rented apartment felt more like a holding cell than a home. When her aunt passed away and left her this house, Emily had seen it as a sign. A fresh start, a place to breathe. She stepped out of the car, pulling her jacket tight against the biting wind. The old house loomed above her, its peeling paint and overgrown garden giving it an air of abandonment. But there was potential here. She could see it in the arched windows and the intricate carvings on the porch railings. As she fumbled with the key, the creak of the gate behind her made her jump. A voice called out, warm and unfamiliar. Need some help? She turned to see a tall man in his late 30s, dressed in work clothes and carrying a toolbox. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his blue eyes held an easy kindness. I'm fine, thanks, she replied, though her trembling fingers betrayed her. The man chuckled and set his toolbox on the ground. I'm Graham Larkin. I live a few houses down. Saw the lights on last night and figured someone was moving in. You must be Emily. Emily raised an eyebrow. How do you know my name? Small town, he said with a shrug. Your Aunt Eleanor talked about you all the time. Said you were a big-shot editor in the city. Emily smiled despite herself. Not so big-shot anymore. Just looking for some peace and quiet. Graham held out his hand. Well, welcome back. If you need anything, I'm just a few doors away. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old memories. The furniture had been covered with white sheets, giving the place the eerie appearance of a forgotten museum. Emily spent the next few hours unpacking, pulling sheets off the furniture and dusting surfaces that hadn't seen sunlight in years. As she worked, she found herself drawn to a small photo on the mantel. It was a picture of her and her aunt, taken when she was 10 years old. Emily's hair was in pigtails, her face beaming with joy as Eleanor held her close. This place was magic, she murmured, tracing the frame with her finger. By evening, the house felt a little less foreign. She had arranged the furniture, lit a few candles, and even managed to bake a batch of cookies using Eleanor's old recipe book. But as the night deepened, so did the silence. Emily's first venture into town was less than graceful. She'd underestimated the narrow streets and had to slam on her brakes to avoid hitting a cyclist. The rider veered sharply, landing in a patch of grass with a shout. I'm so sorry, Emily called, rushing out of her car. The cyclist pulled off their helmet, revealing a woman with curly red hair and a smirk that softened the tension. Guess I should have seen that coming, the woman said. I wasn't paying attention, Emily admitted. Are you okay? I'm fine. Happens all the time, the cyclist replied, brushing off her jeans. I'm Lauren, by the way. Emily. I just moved back to town. Lauren raised an eyebrow. You're Eleanor's niece, right? She was a sweet lady. Used to stop by the bookstore all the time. Emily smiled. That sounds like her. I didn't realize she was so well known. She had a way of making people feel seen, Lauren said. If you're anything like her, you'll fit right in. Over the next few weeks, Emily settled into a routine. She spent her mornings fixing up the house and her afternoons exploring the town. Graham became a regular presence in her life, stopping by to help with repairs or offering to show her the best places to eat. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Graham leaned back in his chair and said, "I can see why Eleanor loved this place. It's got character." Emily nodded. "It's peaceful. The city was a lot. Why'd you leave?" Emily hesitated. "I guess I needed a break. Too many late nights and not enough time for myself." Graham studied her for a moment. "Well, I'm glad you came back. This town needs people like you." But not everything was as serene as it seemed. Emily often caught herself feeling watched, especially at night. She'd hear the creak of floorboards or the faint rustle of leaves outside her window. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but the unease lingered. One morning, she found her front gate open. She distinctly remembered locking it the night before. "Probably the wind," Graham said when she mentioned it. But his reassurance did little to calm her nerves. Lauren, on the other hand, was less dismissive. "Trust your gut," she said over coffee one afternoon. "If something feels off, it probably is." Emily's unease came to a head one night when she discovered an antique mirror in the attic. It was ornately framed, with intricate carvings of vines and flowers. Something about it felt wrong. As she cleaned the glass, her reflection seemed to waver for just a moment. She blinked, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint voice whisper her name. "Emily!" She bolted upright, her heart pounding. But the house was silent. The mirror stayed in the attic after that. The next morning dawned clear, but Emily couldn't shake the lingering unease from the night before. She went about her tasks mechanically, dusting shelves and sweeping the floors, but every creak of the house made her heart skip a beat. Midway through her chores, she decided to distract herself by tackling the overgrown garden. It was a sprawling mess of weeds and wildflowers, but she could see the bones of what must have once been a beautiful space. As she pulled at the tangled vines near the shed, she noticed a small, rusted lock on the door. "Huh," she murmured, brushing away the dirt. The lock was old, but the chain around the door looked newer, as if someone had replaced it recently. She made a mental note to ask Graham about it later. Just as she was finishing up, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was soft, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves, but it sounded eerily like her name. "Emily." She froze, her hand still gripping a trowel. "Hello," she called, her voice shaky. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind. That evening, Graham stopped by unannounced, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables. "Thought you could use these," he said with a grin. "Thanks," Emily replied, forcing a smile. As they sat on the porch, she brought up the locked shed. "Do you know anything about it?" "The lock looks new." Graham's expression shifted slightly, just for a moment, before he chuckled. "Eleanor probably put that there. She liked to keep her tools secure. Want me to help you open it?" Emily hesitated. "Maybe later. I'm not sure I'm ready to deal with whatever's inside." "Fair enough," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But if you ever need help, just let me know." Lauren dropped by the next day with a box of books. "I figured you could use some company," she said, setting the box on the kitchen table. Emily smiled, genuinely grateful. "You didn't have to do this." Lauren shrugged. "Books make everything better." The two women spent the afternoon unpacking the box and chatting about everything from their favorite novels to the quirks of small-town life. "Did Eleanor ever mention the shed in the garden?" Emily asked casually. Lauren frowned. "Not really. She mostly talked about her roses." "Why?" "There's a lock on it," Emily explained. "I was just curious." Lauren tilted her head. "If you want, I can come by tomorrow and help you check it out." Emily hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Yeah, that'd be great." The next morning, Lauren arrived armed with a pair of bolt cutters. "This should do the trick," she said with a grin. Emily watched nervously as Lauren snapped the chain. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air smelled of damp wood and earth. Inside, the shed was cluttered with gardening tools, bags of fertilizer, and old pots. But in the corner, partially obscured by a tarp, was a small wooden chest. "What's this?" Lauren asked, pulling the tarp aside. Emily knelt beside the chest, her heart racing. She lifted the lid carefully, revealing a collection of papers, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. Lauren picked up one of the photographs. It was a black-and-white image of a young woman standing in front of the house. "Is this Eleanor?" Lauren asked. Emily shook her head. "I don't think so. She looks younger, and that dress looks older than anything Eleanor would have worn." As they sifted through the papers, Emily's unease grew. Many of the documents were old letters and legal papers, but one in particular caught her eye: a deed for the house, signed by a name she didn't recognize. Margaret Hensley. "Who's Margaret?" Lauren asked, echoing Emily's thoughts. "I have no idea," Emily replied. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The journal from the shed sat on her bedside table, taunting her with its secrets. Finally, she picked it up and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat but slightly faded, and the entries dated back to the 1940s. May 3rd, 1946. "The house feels different since we moved in. There's a heaviness to it, as if it's holding its breath. Charles says I'm imagining things, but I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone." Emily's breath caught. She flipped through the pages, skimming entries that detailed strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, and a growing sense of dread. One entry near the end sent a chill down her spine. July 12th, 1947. "Charles insists it's nothing, but I saw her. A woman in the mirror, watching me. She doesn't belong here. I try to tell him, but he won't listen. I'm starting to think I'm losing my mind." Emily closed the journal, her hands trembling. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she needed answers. She decided to confront Graham about the journal and the shed. When she knocked on his door, he seemed surprised to see her. "Emily, everything okay?" "Not really," she replied, holding up the journal. "Do you know anything about this?" Graham's expression darkened. "Where did you find that?" "In the shed," Emily said. "Why does it matter?" He hesitated before replying. "Eleanor mentioned something about the house's history once. Said it had a complicated past, but she didn't go into detail." Emily frowned. "Complicated how?" Graham sighed. "I don't know, but if you want my advice, maybe it's better to leave it alone." That night, Emily dreamed of the woman Margaret had described in the journal. She was pale, with dark, hollow eyes, and she stood in the attic, staring into the antique mirror. When Emily woke, she was drenched in sweat. Determined to face her fears, she went up to the attic and uncovered the mirror. For a moment, her reflection stared back at her, normal and unremarkable. But as she turned to leave, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She spun around, but the mirror was empty. Emily sat at the kitchen table, with the journal spread open in front of her. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but it did little to dispel the tension lingering from the night before. She sipped her coffee, her thoughts consumed by the strange entries Margaret Hensley had written decades ago. Who was she? Emily murmured to herself. The entries spoke of fear and isolation, the kind of creeping unease that Emily was beginning to understand all too well. Margaret had documented everything: strange noises, fleeting shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Lauren arrived mid-morning, a bag of muffins in hand. "I thought you could use some carbs after yesterday." Emily managed a small smile. "Thanks. I need it." As they ate, Emily recounted what she'd read in the journal. Lauren listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every detail. "This house has a history," Lauren said finally. "Maybe you should look into it." Emily nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. There must be records at the town hall or the library. I want to know who Margaret Hensley was and what happened to her." Later that afternoon, Emily ran into Graham on her way to the library. He was carrying a stack of lumber, his shirt streaked with dirt and sweat. "Hey, Emily," he called, setting the wood down. "Where are you off to?" "The library," she replied. "I'm doing some research on the house." Graham's brow furrowed. "Why? Something wrong?" "Just curious," Emily said, brushing off his concern. "I found some old papers in the shed, and I want to know more about the previous owners." Graham wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. "Be careful digging into the past. Sometimes it's better to leave things buried." The cryptic comment sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The town library was a quiet, unassuming building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. Inside, the scent of old books and polished wood filled the air. The librarian, Mrs. Delaney, was a small woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a kind smile. When Emily explained what she was looking for, Mrs. Delaney led her to the archives in the basement. "It's not much, but we've got records going back a century or so," Mrs. Delaney said. Emily spent hours sifting through yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and handwritten records. It was slow, tedious work, but she eventually found a mention of Margaret Hensley in a 1947 newspaper. The headline read, "Local woman found dead in tragic accident." Emily's stomach dropped as she read the article. Margaret had apparently fallen down the stairs in her home. The death was ruled accidental, but the article mentioned that some neighbors believed otherwise. She said the house was cursed, one unnamed source had claimed. Emily snapped a photo of the article with her phone. She needed to know more. That evening, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Hensley. She felt a strange connection to the woman, as if they were linked by the house's dark history. She decided to search the attic again. Armed with a flashlight, Emily climbed the creaky stairs and began sifting through the clutter. Most of the items were mundane boxes of old clothes, dusty books, and faded photographs. But tucked behind a stack of crates, she found a small, locked trunk. The lock was rusted, but with some effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside were more papers, along with a locket containing a photo of a young Margaret Hensley. Beneath the papers, she found a letter addressed to Margaret. The handwriting was shaky, and the words were desperate. "Margaret, you were right. The house is not safe. Please leave before it's too late." There was no signature. The next day, Emily shared her discoveries with Lauren. "This is getting weird," Lauren said, examining the locket. "Do you think Margaret's death was really an accident?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story." Lauren leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What about Graham? He's been here a long time. Maybe he knows something." Emily hesitated. Graham had always been kind and helpful, but his warning about leaving the past alone echoed in her mind. "I don't want to drag him into this," she said finally. "Fair enough," Lauren replied. "But if you change your mind, let me know. I'll back you up." Over the next few days, the house seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open on their own. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in empty rooms, and Emily often felt the sensation of being watched. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, the bathroom mirror fogged up with condensation. When she wiped it clear, she froze. Behind her reflection, she thought she saw a shadow move. She spun around, but the room was empty. Unable to ignore her growing unease, Emily decided to confront Graham after all. She found him in his workshop, sanding a piece of wood. "Graham, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice firm. He looked up, his expression wary. "What's on your mind? Did Eleanor ever mention Margaret Hensley to you?" Graham set down his tools, a shadow crossing his face. "Why are you asking about her?" "I found some of her things," Emily explained. "She lived in my house, didn't she? And she died there." Graham sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, she did, but you need to let it go, Emily. Obsessing over the past won't do you any good." "I can't," Emily said. "There's something wrong with that house, Graham. I can feel it." For a moment, Graham didn't reply. Then he said, "Be careful, Emily. Some things are better left alone." That night, Emily dreamed of Margaret Hensley again. She stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," Margaret whispered, her voice faint but urgent. Emily woke with a start, her heart pounding. When she looked toward the mirror in her bedroom, she thought she saw Margaret's reflection staring back at her. The image disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Emily trembling in the darkness. The days following her unsettling dream were tense. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was trying to tell her something. Whether it was her imagination or a true haunting didn't matter. What mattered was uncovering the truth. Determined to piece together more of the story, Emily returned to the attic. She was methodical this time, searching every corner. Among the stacks of dusty belongings, She found a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Margaret and written in a man's hand. Most of them were mundane, detailing everyday matters, but one stood out. The tone was frantic, almost pleading. "Margaret, I know what you're going through. It wasn't your fault. You have to trust me. Leave the house and come back to the city. Please." The letter was signed by someone named Arthur. "Who's Arthur?" Emily muttered, reading the letter again. She tucked it into her pocket and made a mental note to ask the librarian about him. That evening, Emily couldn't focus. The letters and journal had filled her mind with questions, and she felt the answers were somewhere in the house. She just had to find them. She wandered through the rooms, hoping for inspiration. The basement door caught her eye. It was a place she'd avoided, the narrow staircase descending into a darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. Arming herself with a flashlight, Emily descended the stairs. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom, and the scent of mildew was almost overwhelming. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few shelves lined with jars and an old workbench covered in dust. But in the far corner, something caught her attention, a small trapdoor, barely visible beneath a rug. Her heart raced as she pulled the rug aside and opened the trapdoor. Beneath it was a narrow crawl space, and her flashlight revealed what appeared to be a wooden box. With some effort, she retrieved the box and opened it. Inside were more papers, but these were different. They were legal documents, including another deed for the house. This one predated Margaret Hensley and listed a previous owner, Josephine Marks. "Another name," Emily whispered. "How many people have lived here?" She also found a small leather pouch containing an old key. The next day, Emily invited Lauren over to share her findings. "You keep digging up more questions," Lauren said, examining the deed. "Have you thought about taking this to the Historical Society? They might have more records." "I don't know," Emily replied. "I feel like every time I get close to an answer, the mystery just deepens." Lauren leaned back in her chair. "What about Graham? He seems to know more than he's letting on." Emily hesitated. "I don't think he's hiding anything malicious, but he definitely knows something." "Maybe you should push him a little harder," Lauren suggested. "I will," Emily said. "But first, I want to find out more about Josephine Marks. If she owned the house before Margaret, maybe there's a connection." That night, Emily decided to use the old key she'd found. She wasn't sure what it opened, but her gut told her it was important. She started with the rooms on the first floor, testing every locked door and cabinet. Nothing. Then she moved to the second floor. There was an old wardrobe in one of the guest rooms that had always been locked. She'd assumed it was empty, but now she wasn't so sure. The key fit perfectly. Inside, she found a collection of women's clothing, dresses, hats, and gloves, all meticulously preserved. But what stood out was a small wooden box on the bottom shelf. When Emily opened it, she found a necklace with a locket. Inside the locket was a photo of a young woman. It wasn't Margaret. Emily's breath, caught as the air around her, seemed to grow colder. She glanced toward the mirror on the opposite wall, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw someone standing behind her, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Emily shaken. The next morning, Emily decided she couldn't handle this alone anymore. She called Lauren and Graham, asking them both to come over. When they arrived, she showed them the necklace and the locket. "This isn't Margaret," she said. "But whoever she is, she was connected to this house." Lauren frowned. "Do you think it's Josephine Marks?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But I think the house is trying to tell me something." Graham remained quiet, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Emily, are you sure you want to keep digging? Sometimes the past is better left alone." "No," Emily said firmly. "I need to know the truth." Reluctantly, Graham agreed to accompany Emily and Lauren to the Historical Society. The building was a small, unassuming office tucked away on the outskirts of town. Inside, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker greeted them. When Emily explained her search, Mr. Whitaker's eyes lit up. "The Hensley houses? Oh, that place has quite the reputation. Some folks say it's haunted." Emily bristled at the word but nodded. "I've found records of Margaret Hensley and Josephine Marks. Do you have anything on them?" Mr. Whitaker rummaged through a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Josephine Marks was the original owner. She built the house in 1923. Lived there for about 10 years before she vanished. Vanished? Lauren echoed. Yes, Mr. Whitaker said. She disappeared one night, and no one ever saw her again. The house was sold to Margaret Hensley shortly after. Emily's stomach churned. Two women, both connected to the house and both with tragic endings. What about Eleanor? She asked. Did anything strange happen while she lived there? Mr. Whitaker hesitated. Not that I know of, but she was always a private woman. If something did happen, she never told anyone. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, staring at the necklace she'd found in the wardrobe. The house was silent, but the silence felt heavy, as if it were waiting. She thought about Margaret and Josephine, about the eerie whispers and fleeting shadows. And she couldn't help but wonder, was she next? A sudden knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Graham standing on the porch, his face pale. You need to leave, he said urgently. Emily frowned. What are you talking about? The house, Graham said. It's not safe. You need to get out before it's too late. Emily stood frozen on the porch, her heart pounding. Graham's urgent expression sent a chill through her. What do you mean it's not safe? She asked, her voice trembling. Graham hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear. There's something wrong with that house, Emily. Eleanor never talked about it, but I could tell she was scared of something. She always kept her bedroom door locked at night, and she'd never go into the basement. Emily swallowed hard, the memories of the strange occurrences she'd already experienced flashing through her mind. Why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't want to scare you, Graham admitted. But now, I'm afraid it's too late. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Graham's warning echoed in her mind, but her determination to uncover the truth burned brighter. She decided to take one more look around the house, hoping to find something she'd missed. Starting in the hallway, she inspected the walls, running her hands along the wallpaper, searching for hidden compartments or clues. As she neared the staircase, she thought she heard faint footsteps above her. Hello, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, but the footsteps grew louder, moving toward the attic. Taking a deep breath, Emily grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs. The attic door creaked open, revealing the familiar cluttered space. But something was different. The antique mirror that Margaret had mentioned in her journal was now uncovered, its surface gleaming in the moonlight. As Emily approached, her flashlight flickered. She froze when she saw her reflection, or what she thought was her reflection. The figure in the mirror wasn't mimicking her movements. Instead, it stood still, staring at her with hollow, dark eyes. Emily bolted from the attic, her heart racing. She locked herself in her bedroom, the image of the shadowy figure etched into her mind. Think, Emily, she muttered, pacing the room. There has to be an explanation. She grabbed the journal and read through Margaret's entries again, looking for clues. One entry stood out. She doesn't appear when Charles is home, only when I'm alone. Emily's stomach churned. Was the presence in the house drawn to her solitude? She picked up her phone and called Lauren. Can you come over? Emily asked, her voice shaking. Of course, Lauren replied. Are you okay? Just come quickly, Emily said, hanging up. When Lauren arrived, Emily wasted no time explaining what had happened. I think Margaret was right, Emily said. There's something in this house. I saw it in the mirror. Lauren frowned, her skepticism clear. Emily, are you sure you're not just spooked? You've been under a lot of stress. I know what I saw, Emily insisted. Lauren sighed. Okay, let's figure this out. What do we know so far? Together, they laid out everything Emily had discovered: the journal, the letters, the deeds, and the locket. It all comes back to Margaret and Josephine, Lauren said. Whatever happened to them, it left a mark on this place. We need to find out exactly what happened, Emily said. Lauren nodded. Then let's make a plan. We'll search the house, top to bottom, together. The next day, Emily and Lauren began their search. They started with the attic, carefully combing through every box and crate. Look at this, Lauren said, holding up a photo. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, including Margaret and a man Emily didn't recognize. Who's he? Emily asked, Maybe it's Arthur, Lauren suggested. They continued their search, eventually making their way to the second floor. One room had always been locked, and Emily had assumed it was empty. But now, with the old key she'd found, she was determined to open it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty bedroom. The air was heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. On the nightstand was a single item, a black and white photo of a woman who wasn't Margaret. "Is this Josephine?" Lauren asked. Emily nodded. "It has to be." Their search eventually led them to the basement. Emily was reluctant to go back, but Lauren insisted. "We need to be thorough," Lauren said. "If there's something down there, we have to find it." They descended the stairs, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Look," Lauren said, pointing to the workbench. "There's something under there." Emily crouched down and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were more letters, but these were addressed to Josephine. The letters spoke of fear and desperation, mirroring the tone of Margaret's journal. One letter stood out. "Josephine, I can't protect you anymore. Leave the house. Take the locket and go. Please." "It's the same handwriting as the letter to Margaret," Emily said. "Whoever wrote this knew what was happening," Lauren said. As they continued searching the basement, Emily felt a sudden drop in temperature. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Lauren nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's freezing." They turned their flashlights toward the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to shift and move. Before they could react, a loud crash echoed through the basement. The trapdoor slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. "Emily!" Lauren shouted. "I'm here," Emily said, gripping her friend's arm. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, Emily thought she saw the figure from the mirror standing in the shadows. "Let's get out of here," Lauren said, her voice trembling. When they finally emerged from the basement, Graham was waiting for them on the porch. "You're both pale as ghosts," he said. "We need answers, Graham," Emily said, her voice firm. "What do you know about Josephine and Margaret?" Graham sighed heavily. "Eleanor told me a little before she passed. She said the house has a way of keeping people. It doesn't let go easily." "What does that mean?" Lauren demanded. "I don't know," Graham admitted. "But whatever it is, it's tied to those women and now to you, Emily." Emily leaned against the porch railing, trying to catch her breath. Graham's words echoed in her mind. "The house doesn't let go easily." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Graham hesitated, his hands gripping the brim of his cap. "It means what you've probably already figured out. This house has a way of holding on to people. And it's not just about the past. It's about you now." Lauren stepped closer, her voice sharp. "If you knew this, why didn't you warn her?" "I tried," Graham said, his tone defensive. "But what was I supposed to say? Hey, Emily, don't move in because your house might be haunted? Would you have believed me?" Emily rubbed her temples, the weight of everything pressing down on her. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted. Graham sighed and looked her straight in the eye. "Listen, Emily, you need to leave that house. Whatever's in there, it doesn't want you to go, but staying is worse. Trust me." Emily stared at him, her thoughts swirling. The house had felt oppressive from the start, but leaving wasn't an easy decision. She couldn't just abandon her new life or the unanswered questions. That night, Emily sat alone in the living room, staring at the antique mirror. She'd covered it with a sheet earlier, but now the fabric hung loose, one corner exposing the gleaming glass. Her reflection stared back at her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else lurked just beyond the surface. "Why me?" she whispered. The mirror didn't respond, of course, but as she turned away, a faint sound made her freeze. It was a whisper. She spun around, but the room was empty. Slowly, she approached the mirror and pulled the sheet away. The reflection was normal at first, but then her own face seemed to ripple like water. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time more defined. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her face gaunt. "Leave," the figure whispered, the voice faint but unmistakable. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding. The mirror returned to normal, but the warning lingered in her mind. Emily called Lauren first thing in the morning. "I need you to come over," Emily said, her voice shaky. "Something happened last night." Lauren arrived within the hour, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "What's going on?" she asked. Emily led her to the living room and showed her the mirror. "It's in there," she said. "I saw a woman. She told me to leave." Lauren frowned, examining the mirror. "Are you sure it wasn't your imagination?" "I know what I saw," Emily insisted. Lauren sighed. "Okay, let's think this through. If she wants you to leave, maybe she's trying to protect you." Emily nodded. "That's what I think too. But I don't understand why or from what." "Maybe we should focus on Josephine," Lauren suggested. "She was the first owner, right? Whatever's happening now might have started with her." The next day, Emily and Lauren visited the Historical Society again. Mr. Whitaker greeted them with a smile. "Back so soon?" he asked. "We need more information about Josephine Marks," Emily said. Mr. Whitaker scratched his chin. "Let me see what I can find." After a few minutes of searching, he returned with a file. "Josephine was quite the socialite back in her day," he said. "But she had a tragic end. Disappeared without a trace in 1933. "Do you know why?" Emily asked. Mr. Whitaker shook his head. "There were rumors, of course. Some people thought she ran away. Others believed foul play was involved. But nothing was ever proven." Emily flipped through the file, her heart sinking. There was no concrete evidence, just speculation and gossip. "Do you have any records of the house itself?" Lauren asked. Mr. Whitaker nodded. "The house was built in 1923. Josephine designed it herself, wanted it to be her dream home. But after she disappeared, it changed hands several times before Margaret Hensley bought it." "Do you know why Margaret bought it?" Emily asked. "Not specifically," Mr. Whitaker said. "But she was a widow. Maybe she wanted a fresh start." That evening, Emily decided to confront Graham again. "Tell me what you know about Josephine," she said, standing on his porch. Graham looked surprised but didn't argue. "Josephine was before my time," he said. "But my father used to talk about her. Said she was kind, but troubled." "What kind of trouble?" Emily pressed. "Not sure," Graham admitted. "But people in town always whispered about her. Said she dabbled in things she shouldn't have." "Like what?" "Dark things," Graham said, lowering his voice. "Spirits, seances, that sort of stuff. My dad always said she brought something into the house, and that it never left." Emily's stomach churned. "Do you think that's what's haunting the house now?" Graham nodded slowly. "I think whatever it has started with her. And I think it's been feeding on anyone who's lived there since." Emily and Lauren decided to return to the basement one last time. Armed with flashlights and a crowbar, they pried open the floorboards beneath the workbench. Beneath the boards, they found a circle etched into the concrete, surrounded by strange symbols. "What is this?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. Emily's flashlight caught something shiny in the corner, a small, rusted knife. She picked it up, her hand shaking. "This must be what Graham was talking about," Emily said. "Josephine must have performed some kind of ritual here." Lauren backed away, her face pale. "Do you think it worked?" Emily stared at the circle, unease crawling up her spine. "I think it did, and I think we're dealing with the consequences." That night, Emily dreamed of Josephine. The woman stood in the center of the circle, her face contorted with fear. "You must stop it," Josephine said, her voice urgent. "Before it's too late." Emily woke with a start, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do. Emily and Lauren returned to the basement the next day, determined to end whatever Josephine had started. Armed with salt, candles, and a hastily researched banishment ritual, they stepped into the circle. As they began the ritual, the air grew heavy and the temperature dropped. Shadows danced along the walls, and a low growl echoed through the room. "Keep going," Lauren shouted, her voice shaking. Emily recited the final words of the ritual, her voice firm despite her fear. The growl grew louder, and the shadows swirled around them. Then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. When Emily and Lauren emerged from the basement, the house felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a strange calm. "I think it's over," Lauren said, her voice filled with relief. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching. As she stood in the doorway, she whispered, "Thank you, Josephine." The house remained silent. The days following the ritual were eerily quiet. Emily woke each morning expecting something to feel wrong: shadows in the hallway, whispers in the attic, but the house was still. Even Lauren, who had been skeptical of the supernatural, admitted the atmosphere felt lighter. "Maybe we actually got rid of it," she said one afternoon while helping Emily clean the living room. Emily wanted to believe her, but the lingering memories of Margaret, Josephine, and the ritual left her unsettled. "I hope so," she replied. They boxed up the remnants of their investigation, the letters, the journal, and the photographs, and tucked them away in the attic. Emily wasn't ready to part with them, but she also didn't want constant reminders of the darkness they'd uncovered. That night, for the first time in weeks, Emily slept soundly. Determined to reclaim her life, Emily threw herself into restoring the house. She replaced the tattered curtains, scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, and planted flowers in the garden. The work was therapeutic, helping her feel more connected to the house. Lauren visited often, bringing coffee and offering to help with repairs. "This place is really starting to look like a home," Lauren said, surveying the freshly painted walls. Emily smiled. "It's getting there." But despite the improvements, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held secrets. One morning, Emily found an envelope slipped under her front door. It was old, the paper yellowed with age, and her name was scrawled across the front in an unfamiliar hand. She opened it cautiously, her pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "The house isn't done with you." Emily's breath hitched as she read the words. She scanned the street outside, but there was no one in sight. Fighting a wave of panic, she called Lauren. "You don't think it's Graham, do you?" Lauren asked when she arrived. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But whoever wrote this knows something." Lauren took the letter, frowning. "Maybe it's just a prank. Someone who knows about the house's history trying to mess with you. Or maybe it's a warning," Emily said softly. Unable to let the letter go, Emily decided to confront Graham. She found him working in his garden and held up the note without preamble. "Did you write this?" she demanded. Graham looked genuinely confused. "What is that?" "It was slipped under my door this morning," Emily said. "If you didn't write it, do you know who might have?" Graham shook his head. "No, but if someone's trying to scare you, you need to be careful. This house has a way of drawing people in." "People like who?" Emily asked. "People who think they can control it," Graham said. "Or people who want to exploit it. Either way, it's dangerous." A few days later, Emily noticed a man lingering near the edge of her property. He was tall and thin, with a sharp-featured face and an air of quiet authority. When she approached him, he smiled. "Emily Dawson, right?" he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Samuel Price. I'm a historian." Emily hesitated, but shook his hand. "What do you want?" "I've been researching the Hensley house for years," Dr. Price said. "It's a fascinating place, full of history and mystery." Emily crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in being part of anyone's research project." Dr. Price nodded. "I understand. But if you ever want to know more about the house's past, I can help." He handed her a business card and walked away, leaving Emily with more questions than answers. That night, Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the noise grew louder, moving through the house. Gripping a flashlight, she crept downstairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was ajar, a cold breeze blowing through the gap. As she stepped outside, she noticed something carved into the porch railing. "Leave before it's too late." Her heart pounded as she backed away, her mind racing. Who had been in her house? The peaceful days she'd enjoyed suddenly felt like a distant memory. Emily called Dr. Price the next morning. "You said you've been researching the house," she said. "What do you know about its history?" Dr. Price seemed pleased to hear from her. "Quite a bit, actually. Would you like to meet and discuss it?" Emily hesitated but agreed. They met at a local cafe, where Dr. Price laid out a series of documents and photographs. "This house has a dark history," he explained. "Josephine Marks built it, but after her disappearance, every owner has reported strange occurrences." "Like what?" Emily asked. "Apparitions, whispers, unexplained accidents," Dr. Price said. "And in some cases, violence." Emily's stomach churned. "Do you think the house is cursed?" Dr. Price shrugged. "I don't believe in curses. But there's something about that house, something that ties it to its past. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily and Lauren decided to revisit the attic. This time, Dr. Price joined them, his expertise guiding their search. They focused on a locked trunk in the corner, which Dr. Price managed to open with a crowbar. Inside were journals and photographs belonging to Josephine Marks. One journal entry caught Emily's eye. "I performed the ritual, but I fear I've made a terrible mistake. Something is here now, something I cannot control." Emily shivered as she read the words. "She summoned it," she said softly. "Summoned what?" Lauren asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But whatever it is, it's still here." The next morning, Emily found another letter slipped under her door. This one was more urgent. "It's watching you. Leave before it's too late." Emily crumpled the note in frustration. She was tired of being scared, tired of living in fear of the unknown. "We need to end this," she told Lauren. Lauren nodded. "Whatever it takes." With Dr. Price's help, Emily and Lauren pieced together a plan. Using Josephine's journals as a guide, they prepared to perform a ritual to banish whatever entity lingered in the house. "This is dangerous," Dr. Price warned. "If it goes wrong, you could make things worse." "It can't get much worse," Emily said. As they gathered supplies, candles, salt, and herbs, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. As the evening settled into the night, Emily paced the living room, the weight of the latest letter pressing on her mind. Lauren, seated on the couch, was flipping through the contents of Josephine's journals, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This ritual, it's different," Lauren muttered, pointing to an underlined passage. "How so?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "It doesn't just banish an entity," Lauren explained. "It requires a tether, someone connected to the house. Josephine wrote that she was both the summoner and the anchor, which is why it never fully left. It might explain why the entity still clings to the house. And now you." Emily swallowed hard. "So, what does that mean for us?" Lauren met her gaze. "If we're going to banish this thing, we'll need to establish a new tether. And if it works, that tether might be you." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of binding herself to something so malevolent was terrifying, but the alternative, letting it remain, was worse. That night, Emily woke to a strange sound. At first, it was faint, like whispers carried on the wind. But as she sat up, the whispers turned into guttural murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way downstairs, her steps cautious and deliberate. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the windows. As Emily scanned the room, her flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting across the far wall. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with an eerie chorus. Suddenly, the antique mirror she'd covered earlier began to vibrate. The sheet slipped off, revealing the glass surface. Emily's reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection's eyes were hollow, and its lips moved, forming silent words. Then, with a deafening crack, the mirror shattered. Emily screamed, stumbling backward as shards of glass rained down. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Lauren burst into the room, her face pale. "What happened?" Emily pointed to the shattered mirror, her hands trembling. "It's back." The next morning, Emily and Lauren met with Dr. Price again. They recounted the events of the previous night, their voices laced with urgency. Dr. Price listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. "This confirms what I feared," he said. "The entity isn't just tied to the house, it's tied to you, Emily. You've become its new focus." Emily felt her stomach churn. "Why me?" "The house chooses its victims," Dr. Price explained. "It feeds on certain energies: pain, fear, vulnerability. Josephine was the first, but you've taken her place." Lauren crossed her arms. "So, what do we do? How do we stop it?" Dr. Price hesitated. "There's one more ritual in Josephine's journals, one that might sever the entity's connection to Emily. But it's dangerous. If it fails, He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Despite Dr. Price's warnings, Emily and Lauren agreed to proceed with the ritual. They spent the day gathering the necessary materials: salt, candles, herbs, and a ceremonial dagger that Dr. Price insisted was crucial. The instructions in Josephine's journals were detailed but cryptic. The ritual had to be performed at midnight, in the heart of the house. "It has to be in the living room," Emily said, pointing to the journal's diagram. "That's where the energy is strongest." Lauren nodded. "Then that's where we'll do it." As they set up the ritual space, the house seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and deepening. Every creak of the floorboards made Emily's heart race, and the oppressive silence was punctuated only by the occasional groan of the old house. "This place feels alive," Lauren muttered, lighting the last candle. "It always has," Emily replied softly. As the clock struck midnight, Emily, Lauren, and Dr. Price stood in a circle in the living room. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Dr. Price began reciting the incantation from Josephine's journal, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Emily held the ceremonial dagger, her hands shaking. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a gust of wind extinguished half the candles. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing around the room like a chorus of tormented souls. "Keep going," Lauren shouted over the noise. Emily stepped into the center of the circle, the dagger held firmly in her grasp. The journal had instructed her to carve a symbol into the floor, an ancient rune meant to sever the entity's connection. As she knelt down and began to carve, the room erupted in chaos. Objects flew off the shelves, the walls trembled, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. The shadowy figure from the mirror appeared in the corner of the room, its hollow eyes fixed on Emily. "Leave now," Dr. Price shouted. "It's trying to stop you." But Emily didn't stop. She finished carving the rune and plunged the dagger into the center, shouting the final words of the incantation. The screams reached a crescendo, and then silence. When Emily opened her eyes, the room was still. The candles had gone out, and the air was warm again. "Is it over?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Price examined the rune on the floor. "I think so," he said. "The connection is severed." Emily sat back, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I don't feel it anymore," she said softly. "The house feels empty." For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. In the days that followed, Emily began to rebuild her life. The house, once a source of fear and dread, now felt like a sanctuary. Dr. Price continued his research, determined to uncover more about Josephine and the house's history. Lauren, ever the supportive friend, helped Emily finish the renovations, turning the house into the home she had always envisioned. And though the memories of the entity lingered, Emily knew she had faced her fears and emerged stronger. Emily awoke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the window. For the first time in months, she felt rested. The oppressive weight that had lingered in the house was gone, leaving only a peaceful stillness. As she walked downstairs, she was greeted by Lauren, who was sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "You look like you actually slept," Lauren said with a smile. "I did," Emily replied, pouring herself a cup. For the first time in a long time, the two women sat in companionable silence, the tension that had once defined their days now replaced with an almost surreal calm. "So," Lauren began, "what's next? Are you finally going to settle in and make this place your home?" Emily thought for a moment. "I think I will. It's time to stop running and start living." Later that day, Dr. Price stopped by the house to check on Emily. He brought with him a box containing the remnants of Josephine's journals and the ceremonial tools they had used for the ritual. "You should keep these," he said, placing the box on the dining table. "They're part of the house's history, and now they're part of yours." Emily hesitated. "I'm not sure I want to keep reminders of everything that happened." Dr. Price nodded. "I understand. But history is important, Emily. Knowing where you've been helps you understand where you're going." As they walked to the front door, Emily paused. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For everything." Dr. Price smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You faced your fears, and took control. That was all you. With the house finally at peace, Emily threw herself into making it a home. She repainted the walls in bright, welcoming colors, filled the rooms with plants and artwork, and invited friends over for the first time. Lauren helped her host a small housewarming party, complete with music, food, and laughter. The sound of joy echoing through the house felt like a final victory over the darkness that had once consumed it. "It feels good to have people here," Emily said as she and Lauren cleaned up after the party. "It feels right," Lauren agreed. Just as Emily began to settle into her new life, she received another envelope in the mail. This one wasn't ominous or threatening, it was an invitation. Dr. Price had organized a seminar on the history of the Hensley house and invited Emily to be a guest speaker. At first, she wasn't sure if she wanted to revisit the past, but Lauren encouraged her. "Your story could help people," Lauren said. "You faced something terrifying and came out stronger. That's worth sharing." Emily agreed. The seminar was held in a small auditorium, filled with historians, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious locals. Dr. Price introduced Emily as the bravest homeowner he'd ever met, earning her a round of applause. As Emily stood at the podium, she took a deep breath. "When I first moved into the Hensley house, I thought I was starting a new chapter of my life. I had no idea what I was walking into." She recounted her experiences, the strange occurrences, the discovery of Josephine's journals, the terror of facing the entity. But she also spoke about the strength she found within herself and the importance of confronting the past to build a better future. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet, applauding her courage. Months turned into years, and Emily's life continued to blossom. She started a small business restoring historic homes, inspired by her journey with the Hensley house. Lauren became her business partner, and together they built a thriving company. The house itself became a symbol of resilience. Emily opened it for guided tours during the local historical society's events, sharing its story with others while honoring the lives of Josephine and the house's previous residents. One quiet evening, Emily sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden. Lauren joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "You've come a long way," Lauren said, handing her a glass. "So, have you?" Emily replied with a smile. As they toasted to their friendship and their future, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. The Hensley house was no longer a source of fear. It was a testament to the strength she never knew she had. As news of the Hensley house's strange history and Emily's experience began to spread, the small town of Ridgemont buzzed with curiosity. It started with whispers at the local diner, where regulars traded rumors about the haunted house on Birchwood Lane. "Did you hear? Emily Dawson actually banished whatever was haunting that place," one man said, leaning over his coffee mug. "I heard she nearly died doing it," said another, shaking his head. "Crazy stuff. I always knew there was something off about that house." Emily, now a familiar figure in town, found herself the subject of both admiration and skepticism. When she went grocery shopping, strangers stopped her in the aisles. "You're the woman from the Hensley house, right?" one woman asked, clutching a basket of produce. "What was it like? Is it true you saw things?" Emily gave her a polite smile. "Let's just say it was an experience I'll never forget." Some people were fascinated, while others avoided her entirely, as though her connection to the supernatural might be contagious. The town council organized a special meeting to discuss the Hensley house, prompted by the influx of visitors curious about its history. Emily, invited as the unofficial caretaker of the legend, reluctantly attended. "I don't want this turning into a tourist attraction," Emily told Lauren as they walked to the meeting. "It's my home, not a spectacle." The town hall was packed. Reporters from local papers were there, jotting down notes as residents voiced their opinions. "We could use the attention," said Mr. Harper, the owner of the Ridgemont Inn. "A few tours wouldn't hurt anyone, and it'd bring business to the area." "But at what cost?" countered Mrs. Baxter, a retired teacher. "That house has a dark past. Do we really want to exploit it?" When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stood nervously at the podium. "The Hensley house isn't just a piece of history," she said. "It's been a place of pain, but also healing. I'd like to share its story in a way that honors the people who came before me." Her words resonated with many, And by the end of the meeting, the council agreed to let Emily decide how to share the house's history responsibly. With Dr. Price's help, Emily organized small, guided tours of the house. Visitors were shown restored rooms, historical artifacts, and the journal entries of Josephine Marks. On the first tour, Emily stood in the parlor, addressing a group of curious locals. "This house has seen a lot of tragedy," she said, her voice steady. "But it's also a testament to resilience. Every person who lived here faced challenges, and their stories remind us that we're stronger than we think." As she led the group through the house, Emily answered questions about her experience. She emphasized the importance of acknowledging the past while focusing on the future. One elderly woman lingered behind after the tour ended. "Thank you for sharing this," she said, her eyes glistening. "It's good to know that even the darkest places can find light again." Over time, the Hensley House became a symbol of the town's history and a source of pride. Emily worked with the Historical Society to create an exhibit at the local museum, featuring artifacts from the house and stories of its former residents. Lauren, ever the organizer, helped host community events on the property, including fundraisers for local charities. One summer evening, the house's garden was filled with families enjoying a barbecue, children laughing as they chased fireflies. "This is what the house was meant for," Emily said, watching the scene with a smile. "It's amazing what you've done," Lauren replied. "You've turned something dark into something beautiful." Not everyone embraced the house's transformation. A few skeptics in town dismissed Emily's story as exaggerated or fabricated. "It's just an old house," one man scoffed during a debate at the diner. "She's making a big deal out of nothing." But Emily didn't let the doubters bother her. She knew her truth, and the support of those who believed in her was enough. One day, a journalist from a regional magazine visited to write an article about the Hensley House. As Emily recounted her experiences, the journalist asked, "How do you deal with people who don't believe you?" Emily smiled. "I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm here to share what happened and let the house speak for itself." As the house's reputation grew, it attracted people seeking solace. Visitors who had experienced loss or trauma found comfort in its story of redemption. One woman, who had recently lost her husband, approached Emily after a tour. "Hearing about how you overcame everything gave me hope," she said. "Thank you." Moments like these reminded Emily why she had stayed. The house wasn't just her home, it was a place where people could find peace and inspiration. Years later, the Hensley House became a cornerstone of Ridgemont's identity. It hosted historical reenactments, art exhibits, and storytelling nights. Emily's business restoring historic homes thrived, and she became a respected figure in the community. Lauren, ever her partner in crime, managed the logistics, ensuring every event ran smoothly. Dr. Price, now a celebrated historian, often visited to lecture on the house's significance. "This place is a reminder," he told one audience, "that even the darkest chapters of history can lead to something beautiful." On a sunny autumn day, Emily stood in the garden, watching her children play. The laughter of their games filled the air, a stark contrast to the house's somber past. Lauren approached, carrying a tray of lemonade. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing to the lively scene. Emily smiled. "It's everything I hoped for and more." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm, golden glow, Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude. The Hensley House had once been a place of fear, but now it was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and community. "Let's go inside," Emily said, taking Lauren's hand. "There's more to do." And with that, they walked back into the house, ready to face whatever the future held together. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt, suspenseful, and inspiring tales. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories almost every day. Don't miss out, click the bell icon to stay updated, and check out the carefully curated recommendations on your screen now. You'll find more thrilling narratives that are sure to keep you engaged. Thank you for being part of our storytelling journey. We can't wait to share the next adventure with you.